He just spent the past 15 months in Beijing. The Swiss gallerist and co-director of the Galerie Urs Meile, René Meile, has an in-depth knowledge of the contemporary art scene in China. And I'm very glad that he's joining me here in Zurich in the studio today before he travels back to Asia. Hi, René.
Hi, Tanya. Pleasure to be here.
Welcome to Swizz Art Biz.
Thank you.
So, your father founded Galerie Urs Meile in 1994 in Lucerne. Then he expanded to Beijing, and he also has a space, a seasonal space in the Engadin. So maybe can you give us a little bit of context how that happened, that step to opening in China, for instance?
Right. It's actually the whole, let's say, art thing is a bit of a family sickness. It actually goes back even further, I think even 2 or 3 generations before my father. So my grandfather, he already was we would call it an art dealer. He didn't have a gallery, but he was dealing with art. He was collecting. He basically everything from contemporary art to antiquities, medieval arts, and so forth. And my father sort of wanted to stay within this art realm, but he was more into contemporary art. So that's how he then at some point decided to open a gallery for contemporary art, which was, as you said, in 1992 in Lucerne. At the very beginning, there was no connection whatsoever with China. So that wasn't really like a strategical thing. It really just, as many things, I guess, just so happened through a friend of him, Uli Sick.
Non-collector,
and I think in terms of art, but also a person who has been dealing with China already since the beginning of the 80s. A very interesting person, I feel. He was actually the first businessman who did the joint venture between a Western company and a Chinese company, which was for Schindler by that time. And he's been collecting art for a long time, and then was appointed Swiss ambassador to China that must have been 94 or something. And then by that time there wasn't really any, there were artists in China, but there weren't any galleries or museums, basically no spaces where you could see contemporary art. So he asked my father if he's interested to come over and basically do studio hopping. So they just went from one studio to the other to see what the whole art scene is about there. And then for the first 5 to 10 years, it was really mainly that my father showed contemporary artists from China in the West, mainly Europe as well as the US.
And when did he open a space in Beijing?
That was the first show there was in 2006. The whole thing actually developed a little bit earlier. A number of artists actually just ask him, is there a chance? Or have you ever thought about opening up a space in China? Because obviously they were interested also to show their work in China.
There was a need.
There was a need, and they're artists from China. Obviously they want to show their work from where they're from. As well. So that's how it started. And then it was actually through another very early collaborator of my father, Ai Weiwei.
We don't need to explain who Ai Weiwei is.
You met him as well, right?
I did meet him, yes, in Beijing as well.
Yeah.
We both actually we got to know each other in China in 2011-12. I was studying there and you were working for your father?
Right. That was pretty much the time when I really started seriously working with the gallery. Yeah.
Okay. So what did you want to say about Ai Weiwei? He was one of the first artists you worked with.
Right. And he was by that time probably the most influential artist, contemporary artist in China.
In China itself, not in the West?
No, but that time, I mean, people didn't know him in the West. That was must have been in the mid-90s or end of 90s. I mean, a very few people, I guess, knew him in the West. But because he lived in New York in the 80s, so he has a huge understanding about Western contemporary art. And then he moved back to China end of the 80s. So obviously he was, one of the really first generation of contemporary artists from China. And then he had the network, he had the connections and everything already in China. So he actually came up with the idea, or he had the possibility to buy a piece of land and then build something on it. And then he asked my father if he would be interested to use the spaces as a gallery. So the construction started in 2005 or 2004 and then was finished in 2005. And we opened up in 2006. And I actually came to China the first time, not through art, but I was studying sinology in Zurich. And then usually the second year is like
a
you
language
would go
course.
to a university in China. So I went to Beijing to the BLCU, Beijing Language and Culture University, which was a lot of fun. Basically the first semester I didn't learn any Chinese because obviously all of my classmates, they were Mexicans, South Americans, Russians, Koreans, and they all know how to party. So it was actually a very fun first half year. I also lived on the campus, and it could have been anywhere, not necessarily China. But then obviously I was lucky already having quite the network there through the gallery. So I decided, and it was just the time when the construction was finished. So I decided to move to the gallery. So the second semester I lived in the gallery, but then I would go to school every day.
How you lived in the gallery while you were studying? You helped your father out in 2011 when we met each other. So how did you decide you want to work with him? Was it always clear to you?
No, not at all, actually. I mean, it was first the connection with China, or let's say the language. When I, was about to study, I had to choose a subject, and for me, I always had a certain affinity to language, rather than math or biology or so. And then because we always had artists living with us for a certain while when they came from China to stay in Europe for a show, so I knew some of the artists already from there, and I guess I was just fascinated by the language. Generally, I think from childhood, I always had this sort of explorer gene. So I always loved just to dive into exotic places. And by that time, China definitely was very exotic to me. So I decided to study sinology. And then again, it was the first time I went to China was actually to go to university there. And there was really, I mean, I was 19, so that was really the time when, I was sort of uncool to deal with your father or with what your father does. And I mean, he was smart enough to realize that, and not to really push me in any direction. And then after that year in China, I went back to Zurich. I studied for a bit there. And then after 3 years in Zurich, the reason I went back to China was actually I wanted to just, improve my Chinese again. And then it was obviously there couldn't be a better scenario than just work in the gallery. Also, by that time, I basically said I do, I go jobbing at the gallery. I didn't really want to commit myself because I think I was always aware that if I commit myself, there's probably no way out.
Why?
Well, it's in the end, it's a family business, so you cannot just leave like you leave another job behind. I mean, there is it's another type of commitment for sure. So it took me a little while to get used to that thought. I realized that if I always say I just stay for a little while, for a couple of months, and then might do something else, that it's difficult to do really interesting projects, because usually those projects, they would run over 2 to 3 years or so. And yeah, I think that was also the time when we actually met there, and I also just came to realize how interesting it is to work in this field. One thing is China, but I think also the other thing is really contemporary art, where it took me a while to realize what an interesting environment that actually is.
Why would you say is it so interesting? What makes it so interesting?
Yeah, I liked art, but I also realized that if you really love art, maybe working in a commercial art gallery is not necessarily the best way to enjoy art, because obviously you see behind the scenes. I mean, what a gallery mainly does is the management, the development of a career of an artist. So it's about art, but you deal basically also everything that is needed to develop a career. So you really see behind the facade, and obviously that can also take certain illusions.
Okay.
But nevertheless, I think that is interesting. But I think the main part, basically our supplier is the artist, right? Is a person. And I think already that exchange with an artist is just something that gives yourself a lot, right? Because usually artists are people that are able to look behind something, or open a horizon, or just look at things differently.
Can you give me an example of an encounter that stayed with you with an artist? Maybe it was the first Chinese artist you worked with.
I guess it was also with Ai Weiwei, an encounter that I remember, or it was actually because the gallery was really next to his studio, so I knew there was always a huge community in his studio, right? They were like in the high times when he was also advising Herzog und Dümmerow for the Bird's Nest Olympic Stadium in Beijing. He also had the architecture office, so there was his art practice where he had his assistants, and then there was the architecture bureau where he had his people working for him. So it was a huge community of people in my age, and so I would just spend a lot of time there, and I knew Weiwei already since I was basically a teenager, and we did. I helped him once for a photo project, because one part of his artistic practice is photography. So I helped him to build up basically the production and the archive, digital archive, and so forth. And he was always just extremely demanding person. I think.
In what sense? How would you?
Well, he has a very clear vision of what he wants and how he wants to express it. and I mean, he's a person. He's like, he's on the edge of being a genius, but then also a little bit over it. So it's a fascinating person. It's really, I mean, it's a unique person, but it's not easy to deal with. And I think a lot of very successful or just really good artists have this side. You know, I think as an artist, you have to be very consequent in what you do. And if you are that consequent and you don't compromise at all, it's not easy to still be an easy person to deal with, right? So I guess that's what I learned from that time.
Were there moments where you had like, you could really see it was a conflict?
Yeah, obviously. Yeah, for sure. I mean,
fights?
Not so much fights, because, you know, I wouldn't dare to fight with him. He sometimes would hit me with a stick even. It was really old school. I remember, you know, one episode when, so we were actually producing some of the photo works in Zurich, because he would actually have most of his exhibitions outside of China, but he was based in China and couldn't actually export at least the works that are sensitive in terms of the content, political or whatever. So the idea was to actually produce those photo works in Europe, because they anyways were planned to be shown in Europe, so we wouldn't need to export them from China. So I took the photo slides from his studio in Beijing to Zurich, and then we developed the photos. But obviously he wants to see the actual photos, because some of them were, you know, like huge formats. They were like 180 by 250 or something, so really huge photographs. So we developed them here, and then basically I brought them to China, rolled up, I brought them to China, and then he would have a look at it and then, you know, change certain details, and then we print them again. So it would go back and forth
with the roll.
So for quite a while. And I remember there was some sort of deadline for a show that came up, and it was shortly before Christmas. So I knew I had to get him his confirmation on some of the photos beginning of January. So actually we produced, I think it was around 10 or 15, a huge work. You know, it's also in terms of production costs to print a photo in that size is quite expensive. So I did everything before Christmas, and then I just flew to China for 3 days during Christmas to show it and to go to his, because Christmas in China is not really, anyways, he was always working. So that didn't really, he probably didn't even know that it's Christmas. So basically I brought those photos to his studio, and then before I had the meeting, I would discuss with his assistant, and, you know, we would sort of install a bit the photos. So it's always important how you look at something, you know, if it's hang or just on the floor and stuff. So we really tried everything, and I knew I had this one chance for him to go through all those 15 photos and to confirm it, or at least make the last adjustments, so we're done and we can go and do the final printing. Then I guess he had a bad day, you know, I don't know, he has always a lot of different projects going on. He came in, he didn't even look at me, he hardly looked at the photos, and he just said something like, "What is this crap?" and left again. And then, so he had this side. It was really so tough to deal with. And I really thought, okay, what the hell is this? Because I just traveled here basically for 3 days or 2 nights or something. Then he wouldn't even look at it, you know.
So how did you solve it then?
Yes, obviously I told him, that doesn't make any sense. You should at least look at it. And somehow it still worked out. He came back, and then he, you know, I guess he just left behind what was troubling him, and then it was still alright, but the whole thing was actually it left quite an impression.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a funny anecdote. Do you still work a lot with Ai Weiwei? I mean, that was just right at the cusp when he was becoming so famous.
Right.
Right now, I mean, now he's living in Europe, of course. That was also before the time before he was under house arrest, wasn't it? Because it was about...
It must have been after that, yeah. I think that was 2011 when he was detained.
Yes, it was, because I was there at the time.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, then he moved to Berlin, and I think now he's in Portugal.
In Portugal, yeah. So you're less involved.
Yeah, we're less involved with him. Also, I mean, in the meanwhile, besides his work, there is a number of artists that in China, but internationally, are considered as part of the most important, especially painters from China. So I guess also our focus shifted a little bit towards those artists, and they're still based in China, and yeah, this is I guess one of the main things I'm working on now.
What fascinates you by working in China? I mean, meanwhile, it's been a lot of years. China also changed a lot, at least for the people outside, the perception that we have. What fascinates you working there?
Yeah, actually, one thing I just wanted to finish before you were asking me about what is interesting to work as a gallery or as a gallerist in the arts. I think so. One side is the artist side, as we were just talking about, and that, I mean, there are endless these type of encounters I had, or as I keep having with other artists. On the other side is basically our clients, so the collectors, or institutions, curators or writers, and just people basically working also in our field, but mostly, be it the artist or the clients, they deal with art because they love it, right? It's not a job. So whenever you meet people, you don't really meet them in a sort of working environment, but you meet them on a very private level. So people actually come and meet you and visit you because they love it. It's their passion. I guess, I don't know if you compare it to, sometimes not to talk about bad about certain industries, but I guess who loves to go to the dentist, right? Yeah. So as a dentist, you always have to deal with people. I could imagine you have to deal with people who don't really are so enthusiastic to see you, while that is very different in our field. And you just, through having this very private conversations, or this conversation on a very sort of private level, you just really get to know people. And so we've always been working on a sort of international, in an international scene. And while China became more and more, sort of...
It was rising, or...
Yeah, it was rising, and people were more and more interested, or at least wanted to understand what's happening in China. So it's really there are not many galleries who work like we do, with having really a sort of a history in China and in Europe. So whoever would travel from the US and wants to know something about contemporary art in China, they basically would come to the gallery. So I really had the chance to meet so many interesting people.
Can you name one or two?
Well, I mean, there were people from the, what's that in English, Swiss Federal Council?
Yeah, Bundesrat. Yeah. Politicians. What about Hollywood stars?
Yeah, there was once, that was really a long time ago, Matt Damon. No, not Matt Damon. Another, Matt Dillon. I don't know if you remember him. He was an actor. Some, David Lynch was once there. I guess some people I wouldn't know. But, usually those are not really the interesting people. The interesting people, it would be from anywhere, Quite often it's quite successful business people in one or the other way, as Uli Sig, and those are usually the ones that don't want to be mentioned or are usually quite low profile. But then again, because they want to learn something. So when we meet them, they're not really low profile. They just really want to exchange.
So you have dinners together.
Dinners. We would go, obviously see shows, but then also take them to studios, and because obviously they're also interested in just meeting the artist and talking to them. So that I feel that is a sort of a very meaningful side of also, or it feels at least meaningful to me in what we do. And then there is also the context, let's say China, that I feel it at the moment, but already since a while is just a place I think that you really can dive into, and there is so much to learn about China, and it works so different in many aspects as we know from the West.
Just from my experience being in China, it's been over 10 years ago, but I always felt I had a certain image of what it was. When I went there, I just realized it's full of contrasts. You find everything. Often you would find the opposite of what you would think it was, but you would find both. So I think whatever image you have, you could find a proof or something that would fit.
Be it about China or be it about art, I think I'll be able to keep learning until the end of my life, right? And I could do it even longer, I guess. But that's another thing that I realized at some point. These are two fields that will fascinate me forever. I mean, you'll never come to the point where now I got you, China. Now I understand you, right? Never. Also in arts, you'll never say, okay, now I understand what art is about. These are two fields that, they're so full of complexities and it will challenge you forever, I think. Yeah.
And now you just spent such a long time in China. The last time before this interview, basically, when we met, it was in autumn 2020, just right in the middle of the pandemic or the first year of the pandemic. And you went to Beijing and you just came back recently. So almost 1.5 years or more or less. So first of all, I mean, I'm sure when you came, everyone is like, how was it? You were there during the pandemic. When you traveled there, you had to isolate in the hotel, I think 3 weeks. I think you even got Sinovac, no? No.
Right, yeah, I did, yeah.
Chinese vaccine. So how was it to be there during the pandemic, different to the times before?
Because we're used to sort of work internationally. So we from the gallery, but also the artists and the collector, a number of them, they would travel quite a bit throughout the year. Be it for art fairs or to see shows of artists they appreciate or to visit artists. So obviously that was not possible anymore. And also, our clients in China, at least a part of them that would also collect internationally or just like, are part of the international art community, they were just not able to travel. I mean, they're not even able to travel now, really. It's hard to, as a Chinese citizen, to actually go out of China and it's even more hard to go back. So they were basically all just stuck in China, which actually gave me the opportunity to really spend more time to talk about art. Because even though I used to spend, at least 4 to 5 months each year in China, and it's not only Beijing, but it's in the meanwhile, the art scene is basically in Shanghai, it's in Guangzhou, it's in Hangzhou, it's in Chongqing, it's in Chengdu. So there's a lot of traveling within China. So you still just end up to meet some person maybe once a year. And because either I'm not there or that person is not there. And now it was just basically for 1.5 years, everyone was really there. So it created, and then, everyone who had a lot of commitments or things they wanted to see all over the world, now they just basically looked a bit at what's actually happening in China. So they were forced to spend more time on looking at shows and artists from China, which I think was a positive thing. And yeah, on top of all of this, there were a lot of young people that came back to China from abroad, either because they were studying abroad or they were living in, London or New York and so forth, and finished their studies, or just generally because at the beginning, at least of the pandemic, it felt more safe in China than elsewhere. So I think they were asked to come back.
Or just going home, everyone.
Going home, yeah, or were asked to come back by their parents. So that, I think, is an interesting new generation, because they have, to some extent, a Western mindset. They went through Western education, at least part of it, but they're Chinese, and the parents are Chinese. They grew up also in China, so they have a very international, a very informed mindset, and I feel like I connect very well with them. So through all of this, it created quite a interesting atmosphere actually throughout the last 1.5 years.
So would you say that you mentioned these Chinese that were studying or living abroad and coming back? Is it also a new type of clientele that you found?
Yeah, for sure. Because as I said before, they were looking at shows or visit shows in London or in New York or anywhere, basically. So they also sort of grew up with Western contemporary art, and when they come back, obviously they have also that perspective on what's happening in China. So I do feel it's quite different to the generation or people who, didn't study abroad. Obviously, they have a different perspective on things.
And now coming back to Switzerland, how would people react here now to your long stay there?
Well, mostly they were just happy to see me again. Don't want to let me go, which is nice, But I feel that I want to go back. But
you're stuck in Switzerland, right?
I'm sort of stuck here, yeah. But definitely I'm not complaining. I mean, there's hardly a better place to be stuck than in Switzerland. And it's generally not only now, but I mean, you realize whoever visited China before already has quite a different idea about China than people who never visited China. And with people who never visited China, it's hard to really understand what kind of idea they have from China, but sometimes I realize that, they think of it as, I don't know, North Korea or something. I mean, you get these reactions sometimes, like they think I really live in a, place where there, I don't know, there's no internet or whatever. So yeah, sometimes, it really depends. I mean, China, you've been there for quite a while. You have even some past Chinese in your blood, right?
Yeah. But it's been a while since I've been there last. And when I was there, yeah, you would find your ways. As when you mentioned internet, you could still access everything that we consume here by finding your own means. I don't know how it is in the meantime. It seems that it's becoming stricter and stricter. But I'm sure that you also find your loopholes.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I think it is worth talking about really is worth mentioning is the context I'm in China. And, it's actually, you cannot really generalize my experience with China. And that's not China in general.
Yes.
I mean, it's a very elite circle of people that actually move in this field, and it's basically it's an intellectual scene, and it's a very wealthy scene. I mean, it's usually people have a wealthy background or a privileged background, not necessarily the artists, but even some of the artists, and they have, as I said, they have certain privileges, or they have a knowledge about how to inform themselves outside of China. And as you're saying, I mean, it's easy to access information from the West. Basically, what you need is English and a VPN, and then you can, I used to watch alpine skiing in Beijing on Swiss TV and stuff like that. It's this firewall is really, I think, the concept or the idea of
for the mass.
It's for the mass, yeah. So a lot of restrictions, they aim to control the masses, and
who might also not know how to surpass.
Yeah, don't know how to surpass, don't speak the language. And it's also just irrelevant to them.
Then you just get fed what it's there.
Yeah.
But you might also not question it.
Right. Yeah.
How freely can you organize shows in China?
We're being watched in what we show. So it's definitely not as free as here. Also, it is definitely much more obvious than 5 or 10 or even 15 years ago. I mean, you are being watched, which means it's there is I guess from the cultural authorities, they come and see on what we show, and then if it's in terms of content sensitive in their eyes, you don't immediately get shut down, especially if you have a certain history like we have, and we do know, and we know them and they know us, and I mean, there is actually room for negotiation, as for a lot of things in China. It's first quite often says something is not possible, but it's always negotiable. That's also something I guess I learned in China.
Now, maybe going a bit outside of China, but still China, to Hong Kong. Last year it was Art Basel Hong Kong, right? That took place mostly with Goose booths. And you also participated as a gallery. So it was during the pandemic, many galleries that wanted to participate might not have traveled there or couldn't send their staff. Can you maybe tell us how was it? How was it different from other shows?
Traveling from mainland China to Hong Kong was the same as traveling from mainland China to Europe in terms of restrictions. So
I see.
none of us actually were there. So
how were sales then?
Yeah, it was interesting, that your sales were not too bad. We also showed works that that somehow it's okay when we're not there because they're maybe a bit less conceptual, or obviously that I don't know if I want to now go that direction because we talk again another hour. But, it's connected also with what we actually do, right? We don't just simply sell artworks, but especially if we build up career of artists, and when they're younger, that is not that relevant, but we always try to actually sell their works to the best collections. And the best collections actually means whenever a collection has a certain public exposure, either because maybe it's a museum, they have a private museum, or they're very well connected with institutions, so their collection would be shown in public museums. That is actually what helps the artist the most. So when an artist is young, obviously that's the same goal, but a young artist usually also needs money, so it's also just more about selling. You don't really scrutinize too much the collector. But the more established an artist gets, and the longer the waiting list becomes in relation to the artworks, so to say, when there is more people waiting for a work than you have actual works, you need to really have a personal exchange with the collector in order to sell a work. And that obviously is just really difficult to do without having a physical encounter. So, we in Hong Kong, we didn't really show works that we knew. We have to really have a meeting with the collector in person.
Let's maybe go back to China. Because you're soon going back to China. So do you know when you travel?
No, there's no flights at the moment. It sounds silly, but it is.
But you're trying to be there for a certain exhibition.
Yeah, ideally. So we have a quite important institutional show coming up in beginning of April with Ai Weiwei. He's one of the really most important painters in China, and he has a sort of a retrospective at the PSA, the Power Station of Art in Shanghai. It's one of the really good institutions in China. It's where the Shanghai Biennial usually is. And it's sort of a retrospective on a time when the artist himself lived in Shanghai from 2002 until 2008. And it includes around 40 works from that period. And about half of it is loaned from collections in Europe, because especially some earlier works or works from that time are now in European collections. So that's, for example, a show that we've been working on together with the museum, obviously, and the artists for almost 2 years now. So it would just be really a pity not to be there when it finally opens.
Yeah, that would be a shame. What else is expecting you when you go back?
I guess it's not gonna change in terms of traveling restrictions. So if I go, I plan to stay again, for a year or so. I mean, once going through the whole quarantine thing per year is okay. But if it's more than that, it's just really a waste of time. So I guess if I can go, I would stay throughout the year, and then we have 4 gallery shows per year. That's definitely something that I'll be working on. It still depends a little bit on when is which show, because some shows it's more important for me to be there, while others, in the meanwhile, we have such a great team there, so they don't really need me, and sometimes they're even happy I'm not there. And then, there is just so much, and I think again that's something that interests me so much about being in China, because the whole system, the art system, is not as structured yet as especially Western Europe, Switzerland and Germany and France and so forth. So you do a lot of sort of field work. You really go out there and meet people and trying to understand things. Again, if you compare that with Europe, if you're a little bit in the scene, or if you're a little bit informed, the important institutions, the important people. It's even though from outside it looks intransparent, but it's actually
everyone knows each other.
Everyone knows each other, which makes it quite transparent. Because if you mess up, or if someone messes up, everyone knows quite quickly. If you deal with artworks in an improper way, as a collector, for example, you buy something and sell it immediately, people will know about that you cannot really do that anymore in secret. While in China, again, that's connected with the time that there is actually an art scene, which is very short. If you think about it, it's 20, maximum 30 years. So it just takes time to develop such a system of independent institutions, of galleries, all the different auction houses, all the different players. That's not as, I guess, as in other industries as well. It's just a lot of things are not as firm as they are in the West. So established, right? So quite often you only get the information through actually going there and looking at things and talking to people, because nobody really knows. And on top of it is, there's so many young people. There is some collectors there in their mid-20s, and some of them, they already built the museum.
Really?
So you have to really try to figure out what is their intention. What is their motivation to do so?
Which is?
Well, it can be, can be all sorts of reasons. It can be because of tax privileges from the government. When you build a cultural institution, you get certain benefits. It could just be like a status thing, symbol. You just want to be part of something.
As it is here as well?
Yes, it is here as well, but quite often, if it's only this intention, it's not a long-term thing. Because at some point, maybe you reach something, or you actually realize, if you really want to be a top private collector or a top private museum, that's quite challenging. It's far from easy at all. You really have to, go all in. It's not just because you have money, you're not able to establish something like that. You really have to engage. And you don't do that usually for a long time if it's just about showing off. Then you rather just buy a Lamborghini or whatever. So, but that sometimes that is a motivation for people to do so, and then obviously you think twice before you sell an important work to them, but you really try to sell it to people where you see the potential. You know, as we try to figure out the potential of artists, sometimes it's about trying to figure out the potential of a collector or of an institution, because quite often, also in China, you know, there is museums, they just come out, you know, they grow like mushrooms, and then some of them, they just disappear again after some time. Yeah. So, yeah.
Have you been to one that just disappeared?
Yeah, more than one.
Oh, really?
You know?
I mean, I know that happens with restaurants and clubs, that you will come back and they disappear, but not with museums.
Yeah, I guess it's just the dimensions in China. That's another thing. They're just mind-blowing. I mean, you know, you cannot really comprehend the dimensions of China, right? If you only think about the population.
Where does the art go if such a museum disappears?
I guess things that can be sold, they're sold. Things that can't be sold, I don't know where they go. But quite often, there is not even, you know, there is no collection. There is just a museum, like an empty shell.
Ah, yeah.
I don't have now the numbers in my mind, but there is like papers about how many museums were opened in China throughout the last years, and I mean the numbers are ridiculous. You know, there are thousands of museums, literally thousands of museums have opened, but it's easy to build a museum. The difficult part is to actually fill it with content. So there were so many museums built, again, because of tax privileges or
real estate.
You only get a certain piece of land if you do something cultural, and then quite often museums were built, but then there is it's not enough just to have a collection. You need a team to do the programming. And if you look at museums here, I mean, the big museum have hundreds of people working for them. Even the small museums, they have a team of 10, 20, whatever people. And this just, again, takes time to.
So what I'm hearing also when you say that what fascinates you working in China is somehow that the things are not yet set in stone, not established. So I even feel like even though China is a country where you have less freedom in this regard, you might even have more freedom in the art world somehow to set your own rules somehow, because there are none yet.
Yeah, I guess so.
Or do you feel freer there when working within the art world than here?
I do, yeah. For me personally, I do. I guess this is also connected with the fact that just living in a foreign country, you usually you're outside of a society, which sometimes makes you feel lonely, but at the same time, it can make you feel more free. That would not necessarily only happen in China. I think this would happen elsewhere too. I mean, I think another point about the fascination again of art and China, and why I really believe in the potential as well, and why I really think also Western institutions and collectors should look at China, is because it has huge potential in terms of how they value culture. And I mean, I think the understanding of China and its history is just very little from a Western perspective. And I think you realize that when you talk to people in China, again, that's an elite circle. That's really, the wealthy elite. I'm aware of that. But if you talk with, and usually they're intellectual people, and they, if you spend time talking to them and exchanging and also really listening, you realize, I mean, you also can do that. You can read books and see there, but you do realize how the last 150 years in world history is really an anomaly in their perspective, but not only in their perspective, in general. If China has been for more than 2,000 years one of the leading societies in culturally and also socially. I mean, if you just actually have to look at history books, but here you don't really learn about the history of China in school. But it's easy to actually read about that. But then I also realized, and when you spend time there, you realize how this is really in the DNA of people. If you look, for example, at their antiquities, and you see like 600-year-old. I was just as an example. You get invited quite often. Obviously not if you're there as a tourist, but I get invited quite often to people's home. And again, usually they have a wealthy background, and that they have much more, because usually how they get into contemporary art is they are into antiquities, classical art. And when you go to their homes, you see really amazing stuff from the past, from old China, and then
of what is left, what was also not destroyed.
Right, yeah, or that was not taken by the British or the French or generally by Europeans. But there is a lot still, and they're also buying back a lot of it. And just, as an example, in one of the dining rooms, there was like a kind of a water basin, an old water basin made out of porcelain, a very beautiful, also very modern looking, almost like Bauhaus kind of wooden chair. It's really amazing also in terms of design, what has been done in China. But there was this beautiful, interesting thing, and then I asked what it is, and then they said, in the Ming Dynasty, so a couple of 100 years ago, when Europe was really in the darkest Middle ages, where people thought of illness as something God gave you and you have to pray to get rid of it. They had, in every household, they had this basin to clean their hands before they eat. So it was just a very normal thing for them. But then I just realized, they had, by that time, they were so much more advanced, down to really the whole society. If it comes to, for example, illnesses, that you have to clean your hands, that you can actually transmit illness from one person to the other, and that it's not God who gave you this illness. It's just it's maybe a silly example, but when you talk about stuff like that, and then then I said, well, that's amazing, because again, but if you think about Europe by that time, and the knowledge of the general public about certain things was so much more smaller than in China. So people in China, they see themselves as really part of cultural and socially leading society. And it even goes that far that it's not only what would we now consider mainland China, but for them the whole Asian, East Asian area is basically all influenced by the same culture, which the origin is Chinese. And now the wealthy elite is trying to regain and to live that heritage again, and the young people want to also move on and be engaged in their own art and contemporary art. So you really realize that the importance of culture to Chinese people. And this is something that gets completely lost in the discussion or the Western perspective on China nowadays. I feel, because it's so dominated by political or geopolitical discussions, right? If you read the news, basically what you learn about is geopolitics, and it's politics in general. And there we could talk another week about these things. And I think obviously there is horrible things happening, and I think Western governments should not get tired of really pointing their finger on certain things, not only in China, but also in China, that are happening. And in free societies like in Europe, people have been fighting for centuries. And we should, again, I think that Western governments should not stop fighting for these things, and to really make it a topic. But sometimes it helps to try to understand a country on a maybe cultural or social level. And art is just the perfect vehicle for that. You realize that when you sit with someone and you start talking about China, you're immediately on a political level, because that's what you read here in the newspaper. You always read about the government, you read about politics, and that really, it makes people having a very biased idea about China. I'm not saying that it's unproblematic. It's very problematic what the government, what generally authoritarian governments are doing. But I think you have to find, and you have to find a way to sometimes to leave that aside and talk about a society or a culture. And art is just really a great vehicle, because if you just talk with someone about China, you immediately start talking about geopolitics, basically. But if you look with someone at an artwork, and even though it's a Chinese artist, it's a different level.
It's human.
It's a human, and you don't really talk immediately about politics. It's first you wanna understand the artist and what is he doing, and then you're already 1 foot in China, right? And then you can actually talk about stuff. If you already start talking about geopolitics from the beginning, you don't really end up anywhere, because it's hard to really know what's going on geopolitically.
So you find your own access, your own entry point to then be able to talk about anything, but it is through art somehow, also through the human connection, I feel.
Yeah, because in the end, there have been books written about what is art. And I guess the most simple way to put it, it's a form of communication. It's a language. And that obviously, if you don't speak the same actual language, you can use bridges like that, or vehicles like that, like art, to access something.
So you're actually trying to build bridges.
Yeah, I guess building bridges is what I love to do.
No, actually, it's funny because when you were saying there's so much to look at in China, it's still so unestablished. It's still not established, so you can still do a lot. You have to meet artists somewhere remotely because you don't know the art scene just because everyone knows each other. I was thinking about what you said. You always were like a little explorer as a child, so that's where your natural just...
Yeah, totally. I guess so. That's why, to me, it feels fulfilling because you can always look at things from different perspectives, and quite often, there would be so much to talk about. Also, just about the language and.
You speak quite well. I was so impressed.
Yeah, well, after 15 years, it would be embarrassing if I wouldn't. But yeah.
But that is an entry point that you have an advantage because there are a few galleries. I remember when you were in Zhaochangdi, now you moved to a different district in Beijing, 798.
Yeah.
So you're not in that building that Ai Weiwei created.
No, unfortunately not, no.
And I remember, wasn't it Perotin that was also in Zhaochangdi? I think there were a few Western galleries there as well.
Yeah, it was not Perotin. But yeah, they're in Shanghai now. Pace was in 798, but
they're not there anymore.
No.
Okay. Maybe just quick before we wrap up, 798, it's the art district in Beijing. The ULLC, what's the
UCCA? Yeah.
UCCA is just in the same district.
Yeah.
What is left there now? Because you did mention that, you are being watched and it's getting harder. So how many of these galleries are still there?
In Zhaochangdi, you mean?
Yeah, or in 798 or in general. Were there a few that left because it was just getting hard to do business or shows there?
You could maybe... So Zhaochangdi has always been in this kind of unclear state that it's actually since more than 10 years now, there were always rumors that it's going to be destroyed because actually the location is quite good. It's in between, as you remember, it's in between the airport and the downtown. So, and also right next to it, Wangjing, it's quite a good now neighborhood for just residential wise. And so there for sure at some point something's going to happen because it's just like it's a very privileged location. And that's why it's, if you never know for how long you can actually use the spaces there, if as a gallery where you have to plan somehow long term, that's not an ideal scenario. But so most of the galleries they left there now. But it's interesting for artists or designers or musicians or maybe small young galleries who just think I give it a try now for a year or so. So there's still it's still some things going on there, but the bigger galleries they all move to 798 now, including us, because it's just it's a bit more stable, but it's also maybe more contemporary in a way that also the art business, I think that the speed really accelerated, and especially if you have international visitors, it sounds ridiculous, but sometimes they would come to Beijing. Usually they would go to Shanghai and Beijing, and then they would come to Beijing, they go to 798. And before, when you were in Zhaochangdi, which is by car maybe 10 minutes away, they end up not coming to Zhaochangdi because they don't have enough time.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds ridiculous because they would travel half of the world, but then they don't make this extra 10 minutes to come to Zhaochangdi. But that's just how it is sometimes. It's just time is precious, and these things then just matter. And it's a pity if we have people from Pompidou or from Tate or whatever coming to China, and then they don't see the shows we have. So we're definitely happy with 798. I'm still also very happy with Beijing, because as you probably have realized a bit, I think if you look at Shanghai and Beijing, I think maybe a general distinction one could make is that the cultural DNA of China is still in Beijing. I mean, that's where most of the really cultural heritage is. And that's still where most of the critical discourse and the intellectuals from the contemporary art scene are based. And also a number or most of the artists, especially painters, are still based in Beijing, even though the whole infrastructure and so on is in Shanghai is better, because Shanghai is in general much quicker and much better in promoting themselves. And it adapts much quicker to also an international audience or international businesses and so forth. So I mean, if you want to define a little bit those two cities, I feel Beijing is still the place of art production, while Shanghai, in the meanwhile, is probably stronger in terms of art consumption, or especially if you, in terms of international shows, international artists and so forth, there are better museums in Shanghai now.
So are you planning to open a space there?
Yeah, I definitely plan to spend more time there, and maybe open a space somewhere in the future. You always need the right people to do something like that, and you cannot force it. So, but I guess if I spend time there, and then at some point, who knows?
Okay, well, we'll be watching and looking forward. Thank you very much, René, for giving us a trip to China and insight into your work. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
You can listen on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Make sure to rate the show, as this helps the podcast to be seen by others. Thank you very much, and see you next time.